Roger Capello. Welcome to My Week at the Club, episode 52. And this week I have a game against Larry Gladding, where I was white in a Queen's Gambit decline. But before I get into that interesting game, I wanted to share a little astronomy tidbit with you. And what I'd kind of like to focus on this week is some physics errors that they have in that Hollywood has in the movies. So science fiction movies, I really like written science fiction, and movies are fun as well. And so I'm a big Star Trek fan and somewhat a Star Wars fan. But they always make this sort of have this stock scene that bothers my sense of how the universe really works. And you've all seen scenes such as this that show the Millennium Falcon and the Hoth asteroid field, or the Enterprise going through a field of asteroids. And there are very sort of tense snips like this one of Picard actually taking over control, maneuvering the Enterprise through this sort of nasty looking asteroid field, and having a hard go of it and having to make some clever little tricks, but he's going through it about 100 meters per second or so. And it all looks very nice from an entertainment point of view, but it just doesn't work that way. So if you actually look at our asteroids in the solar system and figure out what the spacing is between them, for asteroids that are a kilometer in diameter, if you figure out the volume of the region that's within the asteroid belt and sprinkle the asteroids around within that region, it turns out the average spacing in X, Y, and Z in all three dimensions between these asteroids is about 3.5 million kilometers. So that's about 10 times the distance from here to the moon, and that's in each direction that that these things are spaced out very far apart in all three dimensions. And the question is, well, our solar system is that way. Why couldn't somebody else have this something different? We don't know everything. Why couldn't they have a dense asteroid field? So then it comes down to doing some calculations, because the problem is that gravity and timescales just don't work that way to give you the possibility of an asteroid field like that. They would gravitate together in pretty short order. So I did a calculation of if you took two 100-meter diameter asteroids, separated them by a kilometer, and let them start initially at rest and fall together under the gravity, how long would it take? And it's true, initially the acceleration is very slow, but it keeps building up, and it turns out it's about a day and 3/4 before the two asteroids collide. So what that says is a time scale for the gravitational interaction and collisions between these asteroids is, on the order of a few days. And any asteroid field that is going to be around for millions of years has no chance of surviving that long. Instead, it would just conglomerate into one ball or break into tiny little shreds from all the impacts. So it wouldn't look like this sort of asteroid field that you see on the screen. Hi. Well, once again, I've managed to let life interfere with my recording schedule, and it's actually Saturday, but we're finally on with the chess. So this is a game that I played against Larry on Wednesday night, and as I promised, it was a Queen's Gambit declined. First 2.5 moves or so are sort of unremarkable. Then Larry played knight to f6, which is used to be the very much most standard move in the Queen's Gambit declined. But in recent years, at least at high levels, it's fallen a little bit out of favor. And the reason is, I think, is the line that I tried to play against Larry, where you exchange off the pawns, which looks like it's a no-no because you're allowing that light squared bishop of blacks to get out into the game, but then go and immediately pin the knight after this. And the idea is that white is postponing developing this knight on f3, and that will allow Um, that will allow him to set up a pawn structure a little different than normal, so that he can get his pawns on. Let me change the color here. Go to green squares, a little better. On f3 and e3, and eventually go for an e4 by developing his knight through e2. So I'll show you how that works. So he softened the pin. I won't say broke it. And I play e3 immediately. He develops his knight. I develop my bishop. He castles. And now I play the knight to e2, and leaving f3 open to be advanced. He supports his pawn on d5. And I take time out first with queen to c2. Point of this is, well, as usual, it's several fold. Besides just developing and getting my rooks ready to be connected, it puts extra pressure on h7 with the battery looking at it. And most importantly, perhaps, is that it puts additional control over this e4 square, so that he can't immediately play a knight to e4. So he instead, developed his rook and started to increase his influence along the e file. I castled, and he played his knight to f8. Now this was a little surprise to me. It turns out it's the main line, but he just knew the book lines better than I did, I guess. But this is the point at which I would like to play f3, but the problem is, in this position, if I play to f3, then I have to worry too much about this weakness on e3, or at least that was my thinking. With his rook on e8 bearing down on this e3 square, putting indirect pressure on it, all he has to do is move this bishop out of the way, and I might have trouble defending the e-pawn. He would have to scare the bishop away, and maybe I could just retreat the bishop to f4 and still maintain control over e3. So f3 is playable, at least according to the engine, but it was something that I was afraid to do. So instead, I developed the a rook to e1, which looks like a funny move, but the idea is that I wanted to get in f3 and e4, and I wanted my rooks on those two central files to support that advance. As I say in my notes there were options back here. I didn't have to develop this rook to e1. Another idea would be to develop it to b1 here, and that'll support, well, not with the rook, support the pawn advance with the minority attack, going with my two pawns against his three. And that's just a different way to play the position. So I didn't do that. I played to e1. He surprised me a little, playing the bishop to d7, and I believe this is where we, where we actually left the book of master play. The most popular move here is having the knight play out to h5 and forcing this bishop to do some, well, basically to exchanging the bishop. Either exchanges for a dark squared bishop, or it could retreat here to f4 and get exchanged by the knight. But either way, then that bishop is gone. And there were a number of other moves, but none of which were the bishop to d7. I'm not crazy about this move because it sort of it congests black and weakens his queen support of the d5 square, for example. I finally got in that f3 move that I wanted to make. Larry played rook to c8, showing that he's thinking about advancing his c-pawn to break in the center if I break with e4. And as a result, I played king to h1 at this point. I was a little reluctant to immediately play e4 because of the counterstroke c5, and my center might be a little too weak. Larry answered with a kind of a curious move. He played b5, and it took me totally by surprise. It was one that I hadn't looked at. But looking at it, I mean, well, it turns out it's the engine's first choice. And looking at it, you can see the benefits of it. it's threatening to advance and chase away my pawn on c3, or my knight on c3 rather. And so that knight is important because it's one of the pieces that is supporting this pawn advance to e4, and I don't want to have that knight chased away. I could prevent it temporarily by playing a3, but if I played a3, say, he could simply play a5 and renew the threat. So that didn't really seem to help me on the queen side, so I didn't play that. I thought for about 10 minutes and trying to unravel the complexities that would happen if I played e4. And eventually I did play e4, but it worried me that I might be making a real mistake. The main move I was concerned about at that point was c5. So if Larry played c5, now this position, it was just really hard for me to sort out because there are a whole variety of things that can happen here. I can consider taking a c pawn. I could take the d pawn two different ways. I could trade off the knight, get the bishop on f6, and then push my pawn. I could push the pawn while the knight is still sitting on f6. There are a lot of things. And for each one of those, he has just about as many responses too. One of the major threats would be to push his c pawn forward because my bishop now is trapped. He could also push the b pawn forward and drive away my knight and possibly take, like on d5 with his knight. If I play knight takes d5, he plays knight takes back, that sort of thing. There were just a myriad of possibilities. And just to give you an example of the kind of line I looked at, after c5, I was looking at maybe playing an immediate e5, and if he took my d pawn, I could take it back, but then he can push his b pawn, and that knight is pinned. That was this one of the buried threats here with his advance of that b pawn, is that if the c file becomes open, then this knight is going to be pinned to my queen. In fact, one of the moves I considered instead of playing e4 was to actually get my queen off the file. I mean, I don't lose a piece because I'm actually taking his knight that's on f6, and he takes it back. But this position is it's not. It's probably better for white because I have this blockading knight on d4 that's on a very strong post in front of the isolated pawn. But other than that, it's it didn't appeal to me that much. So I was a little worried about that possibility. Instead of doing that, instead of playing in this position, instead of playing c5, what Larry did was to exchange off the pawn, which again surprised me a bit. I pretty quickly took back because that gives me that strong pawn center that I've been working toward in this whole opening scheme of e4 and f4. But then he plays his bishop to it starts to get his precepts active, I guess. So that the bishop that was doing nothing on d7 and blockading and interfering his queen's control over the d file moves out of the way now and is threatening to exchange off my knight. But I went with a kind of a minor tactical idea here, which is to trade off my bishop for his knight and then push the pawn forward. I didn't want to do it. Didn't want to advance this pawn while the knight was still there because it could have come into d5. So that's what I did, but his bishop actually goes to a fairly active square here on h4, and I wasn't crazy. I mean, it's attacking my rook. I wasn't crazy about the idea of pushing my g pawn because then my king is very weak along this diagonal. I mean, I could do it, but it looks like it might have long-term problems for my safety of my king. And I don't want to give up the exchange at this point. I didn't want to play the knight here and get into this sort of situation where he has an open h file to attack my king with. So instead, I moved my rook, and I moved it to d1, and that was to defend my D pawn basically. It looked a little odd, and I was reluctant to self-pin. So this knight that was attacked by the bishop is now actually pinned by the bishop to my rook. But the problem is if I had played the rook over to c1 instead, okay, then he could win the d pawn pretty easily. So the idea is to trade off this defending knight. You can't do it immediately because I just take back with the knight. So instead he drives away the knight. My knight has to move somewhere, say out to a4. Then he trades off the knight, and no matter whether I capture back with the bishop or the rook, now that d pawn is lost. Now it looks like maybe I could, actually in this position, no, it doesn't look like, oops, take that back. It doesn't look like it at all. In a similar position with the two bishops out here, it looked like rook to f4 was good, but that also wasn't good a little earlier. Yeah, in this position, actually, it looks like I could play rook to c4, winning the bishop. But the problem in this situation is, of course, he just could drop his queen back to d8 and defend the bishop. And so, I would come out of this having lost a pawn. As far as Stockfish, was still happy with White's position, but not as happy as it was a couple of moves ago. So I did not do that. Instead, I played rook to d1 in order to keep that d pawn under wraps. Oh, the idea here is that now if you went through that whole sequence to try to win this pawn, it doesn't work because at the end I have bishop takes pawn check. All right, you can just imagine that in your head. King has to do something, take the bishop or move, I don't care. And either way, this rook would win the queen that was on d4. So the rook is indirectly defending that pawn. And that stays a theme for a few moves. So he decided to replay his bishop to a new diagonal, and that gave me a chance to play my knight to a much more active square than it was on. C3 was kind of a sucky square, whereas e4 now is giving me some nice squares to look at here, either c5 or d6. They both look pretty juicy, and in particular d6 is threatening a rook fork if he does nothing. That's an immediate threat. So what he did was to play one of the rooks forward to e7, his e-rook. And at this point, I was so wrapped up with the idea of getting my knights on these squares. So, whether I should put this e-rook onto c, or e-rook, the e-knight onto c5 and maneuver my other knight on a zigzag path and get it over somehow to d6, or to do what I actually did with my knight, which is to put this to play immediately into d6. Anyhow, I was so busy with that idea, I didn't look at the drawbacks of his move. And the drawback when you see it, especially if somebody comes along and drops a red on the square where the bishop is lying, is that he has stranded that bishop. It's lost over there. And there's no way, no safe place to move it if I attack it. And so, simply playing g3 here to attack that bishop, there's no way to save the bishop. He could try to complicate a little, but the bishop actually ends up being lost. The idea here is after g3, okay, then he could play c5, threatening this, to advance the pawn and attack this bishop that's momentarily trapped. And I would have to do something about it. I can't move this knight because then his bishop can get free, but I can take it with the pawn. And then he has nothing better than to put his bishop on that active diagonal. And I win his bishop, and it looks scary with that, all the activity along this light square diagonal, particularly after his rook takes a pawn. But I could attack his bishop, drive it back, or let me exchange it, that'd be fine too, and then drop back with my knight. And this is a position that it's not 7.5, but it's let's see, it's pretty good according to Stockfish. Yeah, plus 3.5, something like that. So definitely a winning advantage. that didn't happen. Instead, I played a good move. It's just not the best move, which was knight to d6. And it not only attacks his rook, and I thought was going to win a tempo because I expected him to move the rook maybe to b8, but also it it shelters the d pawn from the queen's attack. So the queen was threatening at some point to maybe take the d pawn if this knight moves or if it gets traded off. And this knight is kind of a bone in his throat there. It makes it very hard for him to work around that knight to develop his pieces. It takes away a number of light squares from him. And most importantly, I think, is that it adds an attack to this f7 square, which is really the object that I'm going after in this position. Because with my open f file now and my rook bearing down on that square, it looks like it could be developing a real problem point for black. Okay, well, he moved his other rook, doubled his rooks, allowing me to take the rook on c8, but I didn't take it immediately because my knight is so good, it seemed in this position like it was better than his rook. So instead, I brought my other knight up to see if I could get them coordinated and working together at close quarters. He moved his bishop to d5, and that's quite an active square for his bishop to get onto. As I was pointing out before, it's indirectly bearing down on my king here and might actually cause some problems. And according to Stockfish, this is the line that I was 7.5 that I missed. If I went ahead and exchanged off that bishop immediately, and he took back, I was reluctant to do that because of because I'd be opening up this doubled rook attack on my queen. But point is I could have moved my queen to b3 and had a double attack on this pawn that's on b5 here, and also an attack on this d pawn, which is very hard to defend. It's really basically no direct defense that can be made of that pawn. And best he can do is to keep from losing the exchange. And I take that pawn. Now I have a third attack on f7, and this is a lovely position for white. But I didn't do that. Instead, I got a little scared and decided he's starting to get some active pieces here. I'd better cash in some material. And so I traded that lovely knight for his rook. But it wasn't, not a bad move. It's just not my best. Okay, he took back with the queen, and I thought he might do that. But whether he took with the queen or the rook, I had this answer ready to go, bishop to f5, which takes back control of that of the c8 square and wins a tempo as the queen has to move. So after he did that, I then exchanged the bishop, and he can't. At this point, he doesn't really want to take with the queen because I could then have a strong responsive bishop to e4 and putting a lot of pressure on this backward c pawn. So instead, he takes back with the pawn, which does give him a tempo, given that his rook is attacking my queen, but it makes this pawn turns the backward. Oops, forget that. The backward c pawn into an isolated d pawn, so it's really not much of a step in the right direction. And my queen is able to redeploy, and in particular move over toward the king side. And I was hoping to get over here where I could coordinate with my bishop and also this rook on the f file and attack his king. And I was doing so by also winning a tempo, I thought, because I was attacking his b pawn. And I expected a6, defending that b pawn. That's not what he did. He actually played bishop to g5 instead, which was kind of a bit of a surprise to me. And I thought about it for a while, and I was a little worried that maybe I was missing a trick, but I couldn't see it, so I went ahead and grabbed the pawn. So now I'm 2 pawns ahead. Well, no, just 1 pawn ahead, sorry. 1 pawn ahead, but I have that weak I guess in my mind I have that weak D pawn already won. But anyhow, it's if I got into an endgame now, it looks like it would be pretty good for white. But we have ways to go before we get to an endgame. He played his rook to e7, which again is kind of a peculiar move because it cuts down on the mobility of the bishop. But I should have. I guess I should have figured out from his move what he had in mind, and that's that eventually he's going to push this. He wants to push the f pawn, but I wasn't even considering a move like that. So I developed my rook with the idea of either playing the rook over to the queen side or to the king side to attack. In particular, rook to h3 I thought would be interesting to pile up somewhere on the h pawn. Also, there's the idea that I might double rooks on the f file. But he surprised me, as I said, with this pawn to f6, which I think he was preparing with that rook move 2 moves ago. And this sort of mesmerized me. I kind of got so focused on what was going on with that pawn that I felt like this was a weakening move, that it would allow me to attack on the light squares and open up his king's position. But I couldn't exactly see how best to take advantage of it. At least it took a little bit of work. And because of that, I was focused on the wrong place on the board. And what I should have been looking at was, as a response here, is just rook to c3. And now this is a dynamite move, because this rook to c8 threat is very hard to meet. I mean, he can move his queen, but the rook's still going to come down there, and it's dynamite getting that rook into the game. And I shouldn't have been so worried about the fact that he's attacking my e pawn a second time. His d pawn remains weak. This is just exactly the kind of open line play that white should be looking for in this position. So instead of that, I traded off the pawn. And he took back with the bishop. And I moved my bishop in order to get it to where I could attack his weak d pawn. And meanwhile, he said, well, if you're going to do that, I'm going to put a second attack on your weak d pawn. Yours can be just as weak as mine. But the problem is that I'm happy to go with that. And so I played bishop to f3. And if he had done that, I would have traded the rooks off and taken on d5. Instead, he retreated his rook. And that allows me simply to win his d pawn with check and force a queen trade. So the queens come off, and I suspect what he was thinking is that now we have a bishop of opposite color endgame, or can quite likely have it. But the thing is, I'm an exchange up at this point, so as long as I stay that exchange up and don't just get into a pure bishop endgame, I'm probably in excellent shape. White's 2 pawns and an exchange up, so it's by any standard it should be a winning advantage. Okay, he moved out a check, as we often do, and I retreated my bishop, and now I start to the next half dozen moves or so I don't play very well. I was getting short on time, and I really should have been a little more accurate with some of these moves, but so I moved my bishop back. It would have been a little better to move it forward to c6 and then support it with a pawn. It gives his knight a chance to develop through that d7 square. I defended my bishop. There's nothing wrong with that. He started getting ready to deploy his king, and his king gets into the game more easily than mine does, and that's a problem here. So I decided I would see if I could develop my rooks on the or double my rooks on the f file rather. But he moved his bishop before I had a chance, attacking my rook. And right here, if what I wanted to do, was to double rooks. And the problem was I saw that if I doubled rooks, I saw that he had this move with the bishop of forking my rook and the pawn. And I didn't like that, but it turns out, that would have been okay. And if I'd had enough time to analyze, I would have seen that I'm not actually losing a pawn in this sequence, because I could go up and attack his rook. He can't just move it away because the knight drops. He trades it off. His knight's still under attack. He has to move that knight. And then I have time to move the pawn. And so I haven't lost anything. And this is really an easily won endgame. But I didn't have time to work that out. So instead I took the coward's way out. I dropped my rook back. I wanted to stay solid on the back rank because I was getting pretty concerned about a back rank mate at this point with this pawn formation and my king tucked in the corner. I didn't want to take any chance of that. So this gave him a chance to bring his knight out. And now his knight all of a sudden is going to become very active. And so first I took time out to offer a rook trade. He didn't want to do it, so I went back and defended my pawn again. And now he's able to deploy his king to a more active square. And I said I better get my king into the game as well. Right, so I played, well actually I didn't. First I played d5, that's right. Getting the pawn onto a square where it's defended twice and also advancing it. And so I thought I could maintain it there for a while. And he played his bishop to a strong diagonal here. This diagonal from a7 to g1 is it's quite good. It keeps my king from using these dark squares. And it actually is, as you'll see, it's quite important on that diagonal. And I came up with a bad idea about how to get my king into the game. And that was to play g3. I didn't, I wanted to play on the light squares. He retreated his bishop, and then I pulled a real boner, and that's king to g2. And the problem here is that, my king and two rooks are both all within a knight's circle of that e3 square. That is, a knight on e3 can attack all three of those guys at once. It's triple fork. That last one didn't work too well, but you get the idea. And his answer was very strong. He simply played knight to g4, and all of a sudden I said, uh-oh, there's a triple fork threatened here, and no matter what I do, I can't get out of it because I can only move one piece and there's still a double fork. And I could move her. The only thing I can defend this square with that, I could take with, I could move my king to defend it, but that doesn't help. He could still play knight here and take one of my rooks. If I move a rook, which is what I ended up doing to defend that square, he can still go there with the knight and fork my king and rook. And either I move my king and let him take my f rook, or I use my e rook to take on e3, which is what I did, and he takes the e rook. So he's won the exchange back. But white's still 2 pawns ahead. But we're getting a lot closer to bishop of opposite color endgame. And I should point out that, as you probably saw in the notes, if you're looking over there on the side, that on several moves ago, on this move, when I played d5, that was actually when I stopped recording because I was down to about 3.5 minutes on my clock. And so this was all played at pretty quick rate, and that's my excuse for moving into this fork situation, although it's, I'm the one who put me into time pressure. So after this sequence of moves, and I chase him away, Larry actually stopped recording as well. I think I know the next move was bishop to c5, but that was the last we have of the game. And I tried to reconstruct it after I got home, but we played so fast, and we had played about 40 moves more, or something like that, that I wasn't able to do so, at least definitely not with any accuracy, because there was some dancing around back and forth with my rook on the 2 files and his rook on the 2 files and so on. But basically what happened was that the pawns all got advanced by 1, so that we got a stable pawn structure on those squares. And eventually, after some to and froing, like I said, I was able to get a position where he wanted to trade rooks off, and he did. And so it was just the king and light square bishop against the king and the dark square bishop, with white having 2 extra pawns. and I was able to bring my king over to the queen side, and at that point, and with the two combined weaknesses of having to pass D pawn and eventually passing an A pawn over here, I was able to force a one game. But it was not easy. I made it a lot harder than I needed to on myself, uh, and it should have. There were several places there where I missed some nice opportunities, like this possibility for doubling the rooks on the F file, or a little earlier where I was able to exchange off and move my queen and then win that D pawn. That it was just a crushing position where I missed those things. Oh yeah, and the bishop was trapped earlier too. So there were quite a few missed up chances for me. And I'm sure Larry would probably take back some of his moves if he had the chance, but I guess that's the way chess works. So that was it. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next week with the last round game. I'm scheduled to play Brett Kildall on board one. Brett is 4-0. I'm 3.5 because of that draw that I had against Ken Gurge back in the second round. So we'll see how it goes next week. Bye-bye.